Since the murder of George Floyd, I have heard two different voices from you, from the members of Temple Emmanuel. By far the more common voice is the voice of moral outrage at the structural racism, at the systemic racism that the murder of George Floyd revealed. That quintessential voice went something like this. You know, I kind of knew, but I guess I didn't know well enough. I kind of saw, but I guess I didn't focus well enough. You know what? I should have been doing more. I feel badly that I wasn't doing more. But now I am awakened. Now I am committed to ending structural racism in this country. What books should I be reading? What films should I be watching? How can I do some training that will allow me to uncover my own implicit biases? I am with the program. I want to do my part to end structural racism. That is by far the more common voice. And that voice, both Michelle and Eliza delivered powerful sermons the last few weeks, channeling and responding to that voice, the voice of moral outrage and determination now to remedy. But it's not the only voice. There's also a second voice, also heard from members of Temple Emmanuel. And that second voice is also real. And that second voice also deserves a sermon. That second voice will start with caveats and qualifications. Of course, the murder of George Floyd was terrible. Of course, I decry racism in any form. But there's always a but. And the but is, Black Lives Matter is anti-Semitic. But Black Lives Matter is anti-Israel. The but is, many of the activists who are marching with Black Lives Matter are anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, and there's always a question, a pointed question in the conversations, in the comments, in the emails. Why aren't you honest about the reality of Black anti-Semitism? And so today, I want to talk about the reality of Black anti-Semitism. And the first thing that I would say to that second voice is you have a point. You're absolutely right. Many of the activists who walk with Black Lives Matter are anti-Israel, and they are anti-Semitic. That is true. If you read the platform, the official statement of Black Lives Matter, which was enacted in 2016, the only reasonable construction of it is that it is virulently anti-Israel. The official Black Lives Matter platform says that Israel is guilty of committing genocide against the Palestinian people. It specifically chooses to use that fraught and loaded term, genocide. It argues that America, in supporting Israel, is complicit in the genocide of the Palestinian people. It argues that a global effort of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, is morally appropriate, and that people committed to the cause need to work to ensure that it will be effective. And it argues that any resistance to boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a violation of the constitutional right to free speech. Now, in that vein, someone who channels that is a woman named Michelle Alexander. And this is a double heartbreak for me, a double heartbreak for me. Because I was and am a huge admirer, a huge fan, a huge devotee of Michelle Alexander. She wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, which is absolutely foundational reading. If you want to know what's going on in America today, and if you want to know what are the problems with structural racism, The New Jim Crow about the reality of mass incarceration and what it means for African Americans, what it means for America, it is just required reading. I'm a huge Michelle Alexander fan. But as right as she is about America, that is how wrong she is about Israel. On Martin Luther King Day, 2019, she had an op-ed piece in the Times called "Time to Break the Silence on Palestine." And when I read this article and saw that it was from Michelle Alexander, I was horrified because it's so off and so one-sided and so devoid of facts, truth, and nuance. You know, a picture paints 1,000 words, so this is just one picture that says it all about Michelle Alexander on Israel. Her piece was accompanied by a photograph of two Palestinian boys in Gaza who were standing amidst the rubble of what had been a cultural center in Gaza. And the caption underneath the photo read, "Boys standing under a cultural center that had been demolished by an Israeli airstrike." And she writes about that, and you have a picture of that. And it's absolutely true that Israel demolished that cultural center by an airstrike. But you know what's also true? So interesting she didn't mention it. Why Israel demolished that cultural center. Israel demolished that cultural center because Hamas had been sending from that cultural center and from civilian sites, from hospitals, from preschools, from nurseries, from elementary schools. Hamas had been sending thousands, tens of thousands of missiles and rockets and Qassams on innocent Israeli civilians, on innocent Jews who are living their lives, and Hamas is literally raining down terror on them. And Israel did what any nation would do. Israel defended its citizens who were getting bombed to death by attacking the bombers. And somehow Michelle Alexander does not see fit to mention that inconvenient fact. Nor does she mention at all that actually Israel withdrew from Gaza entirely in 2005, the Heat Nakut. And if you know the story and follow the news, this was hugely controversial in Israel. It took Ariel Sharon at the time to do it. And he sent in the Israeli army to get Israelis out of Gaza. Hugely controversial and wrenching. And Israel did this to give peace a chance. And no sooner does Israel take its people out of Gaza, using the Israeli military to do so, then Gaza starts launching missiles on Israeli civilians. And that's why the cultural center was destroyed. Michelle Alexander doesn't mention that, nor does she mention the many times that Israel tried to make peace with Palestinians after Oslo, under the Clinton administration, and was met with exploding buses and suicide bombers and cafes. The first intifada, the second intifada. She doesn't mention that either. And it's not just anti-Israel, it's clearly anti-Israel. It's also, and very definitely, anti-Semitic. Because to not care about dead Jews, spilled Jewish blood, children being bombed by Qassam missiles, and you don't care enough to even mention it in the article, not a footnote, not a word, not a syllable, not a comma, nothing, dead Jews not in the picture, that's not just anti-Israel. There's also anti-Semitism. That's Michelle Alexander, too. So, it's a conundrum. Michelle Alexander is so right about America. She is so wrong about Israel. Black Lives Matter is so right about America. They are right about America, and they are so wrong about Israel. What do we do? That's why we got that second voice. So I went to the wisest person I know, and I went to the greatest person I know. I went to my father, who lives in Jerusalem, retired rabbi. He's 92 years old. And there's two things you need to know to frame this. Number one, in all the cities that he had congregations in, namely Chicago, Minneapolis, and Atlanta, a big part of his rabbinate was being progressive and building bridges with African American community. In fact, he gets to Atlanta, Georgia in 1981. That's Georgia, 1981. And he's succeeding a Rabbi, Harry Epstein, who had been there for 54 years. And at the time, this was the biggest congregation in North America. And at the time, they had over 5,000 people in attendance. And this is his first sermon. And for his first sermon, he talks about Dr. Martin Luther King and I Have a Dream. And when he's done with the sermon, the president walks up to him in the middle of the service and says, "Rabbi, you're new here, but never again mention the name of that man in this synagogue." And my father-in-law spent the next 20 years trying to change that. That's the first thing, deeply committed to racial justice as a cornerstone of his rabbinate. Second thing is when his rabbinate was over, he moved to Israel. He and my mother-in-law lived there for 16 years until she passed away. She's laid to rest there. His children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, Israeli. So I called him up and I said, "Dad, Michelle Alexander, so wrong on Israel, so right about America. Do you have any wisdom?" He said, "Absolutely, it's actually very simple. 3 words. What are the 3 words? David Ben Gurion." David Ben Gurion, I said. What's the relevance of David Ben Gurion to Black Lives Matter? And he explained that in 1939, in the Yishuv, which was the Jewish community in pre-Israel Palestine, that a very complex relationship with England. On the one hand, England was fighting Nazi Germany, and the enemy of my sworn enemy is my friend. So how could they not support England in fighting Hitler? But on the other hand, England had authored the infamous White Paper, which severely limited Jewish aliyah to Israel when Jews needed aliyah to Israel the most, and England shut the doors, made it illegal to immigrate. How could Jews in the Yishuv possibly support a nation that came up with the infamous White Paper? So here's what David Ben Gurion says. He says, "We must assist England in fighting this war as if there is no White Paper. And we must resist the White Paper as if there is no war." In other words, fighting Nazi Germany and resisting the immigration restrictions were both super important. And Ben Gurion was counseling that we disentangle these 2 issues and deal with each of them on their own. Channeling David Ben Gurion now, we need to fight racism as if there is no anti-Semitism and no anti-Israel animus. And we need to fight anti-Semitism and anti-Israel animus as if there is no racism. Applying that lens to now, that means that I would say to the members who have offered that second voice, "But what about Black anti-Semitism?" I would say, you're absolutely right. And I would also say, we need to walk with Black Lives Matter now. I walk with Black Lives Matter now. We need to walk with Black Lives Matter now. Even so, and we need to do it for 2 reasons. First is, it never goes out of fashion to ask the question, what is the right thing to do? It's always a good question to ask. What's the right thing to do? Well, what the right thing to do is to work to end America's history of structural racism. That's the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to work to change our society so that people of color don't have to be afraid of racist cops who are going to harass them and intimidate them and arrest them and shoot them for no good reason. The right thing to do is to not let 8 minutes and 46 seconds happen in vain. The right thing to do is to work to create a country where we never, ever, ever hear the words again, "I can't breathe." That is the right thing to do. And it's also the wise thing to do. If you love Israel, you know this is a big world, and Israel's a small country. And we are a small people. And we need friends and allies. And it is just human nature that if you walk with other people, they walk with you. And it's just human nature that if you're there for other people, they are there for you. A few years ago, Cambridge City Council was on the verge of passing an official boycott, divestment, and sanctions petition. It's going to make Cambridge apply BDS to all of its merchants. And this was hotly contested by the Jewish community, and it looked like we were going to lose. And it looked like Cambridge was going to become a BDS city. And then somebody from JCRC called me and said, "Do you know anybody in Cambridge who has moral stature, who has moral presence, who would raise a moral voice against BDS?" And I picked up the phone and I called Brenda Brown. Brenda is the pastor of the Mass Avenue Baptist Church. And we've been in relationship with the Mass Avenue Baptist Church for more than 30 years, working to ameliorate hunger. And I called Brenda and I said, "We need you now. Cambridge is about to pass BDS. BDS is immoral. BDS is wrong. BDS is anti-Semitic. Would you lend your moral voice and raise a moral case against BDS?" She said, "Done, absolutely. Tell me when, tell me where, I will be there." And she did. And her moral voice and the opposition of the black church that she represented was absolutely pivotal. And the Cambridge City Council withdrew the BDS petition. We need to walk with Black Lives Matter because it is the right thing to do, and it is the moral thing to do to end systemic racism in our beloved country. And we need to walk with Black Lives Matter because we need friends. You know, what this moment calls for is nuance. Problem is, there's so much noise in the system. And noise is the enemy of nuance. Let's resist that. Let's own and embrace nuance. After all, David Ben-Gurion's Torah is nuanced. It's nuanced. Assist the British as if there's no white paper. Resist the white paper as if there's no war. That's nuance. That's what we need to do. And it would look like this. Make America more just. Walk with Black Lives Matter. For the sake of Zion, never be silent. Both true, both urgent, both valid, both our sacred work. Shabbat Shalom.